Hello again. I do get awfully tired of seeing fantasies about indigenous African civilizations being promoted, as though Africans were capable of monumental architecture and writing before the arrival of outsiders who taught them about such things. I mention monumental architecture and writing, of course, as these are two of the defining features of all civilizations. The problem is that repeating lies often enough might well eventually persuade ignorant people that the falsehood is in fact veridical. It will not alter history. We see this all the time these days. Supposed African civilizations such as the Empire of Mali and so on. And it's all a fraud. It's a hoax. Before looking at some of the claims for supposed African civilizations, I must go off at what might seem at first a tangent, which is to look at language and religion in Africa and Asia. There is a reason for doing so. It's not merely the ramblings of an old man. In sub-Saharan Africa, the traditional religions are animist. This means that many things are thought to have their own spirits or gods. The Yoruba in Nigeria, for instance, have a thunder god called Shango, and sometimes even individual rivers or trees were believed to have their own minor gods. We see something similar in the ancient Roman and Greek myths, obviously, the naiads and dryads and Pan, the goddess of woodlands and so on. And I might mention also in the Norse gods, we have a thunder god, Thor. He's cognate with Shango. In that part of Asia known as the Middle East, on the other hand, there has for thousands of years been a strong tradition that there is only one universal God. There is also a specific language group associated with the Middle East, the Semitic languages, such as Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic. These are quite different from the languages spoken in sub-Saharan Africa, the languages of the Bantu. We are thus able to see when some culture is dominant or has colonized an area, we can recognize what has happened because the language and religion of the conquerors is usually then introduced to the subject people. One thinks of the Christian missionaries who went to Africa from this country and the way in which English is still an official language in Nigeria. The language of the colonizer, the religion of the colonizer tends to stick. It doesn't move in the other direction. When we colonized what is now Nigeria, of course, we didn't take back to England the customs of the animist religion or Yoruba expressions or anything like that. It's the conqueror, it's the colonizer whose culture is dominant, which affects the ones who have been colonized. It never works the other way around. Whenever we see some civilization in Africa, the ones, for instance, which are often mentioned as instances of indigenous African civilization, we can therefore see at once if this is true, if these really are original African civilizations. And we can do that simply by looking at the language and religions found there. If they are really indigenous, they will have animist religious practices and African languages. If they don't, then they're not indigenous. So it is that whenever we see some such culture in Africa which features churches or mosques, or where Semitic languages are spoken, or Christianity, Islam, or Judaism practiced, we know at once that these are essentially the product of outside sophistication which has been introduced to Africans. I'm thinking now of the civilization of Aksum in Ethiopia, the Kingdom of Mali, and of course the whole of the Swahili coast of East Africa. When we see, say, in Ethiopia, a church cut from the living rock 800 years ago and called Bet Mariam, then we can tell at once this is nothing to do with native African culture or civilization. You see, I can tell you immediately what Bet Mariam means because it's the same as the Arabic or Hebrew. It means the house of Mary. This is because the important language of Ethiopia and Eritrea, I should say languages because I'm implying to Tigrinya. So Amharic and Tigrinya are the same family as Arabic and Hebrew. This area was colonized by Arabs and Jews many years ago, and these people introduced Islam, Christianity, and Judaism to Africa, in the same way that Arabs introduced Islam to Mali. That's why the rulers of Mali in the Middle Ages were all Muslims and why there were mosques there. We know that the colonization only went in one direction because there are no African languages spoken in Arabia, and nor are there any traces of animist religions either there or in North Africa. The flow of culture went only in one direction, from the colonizers to the areas which they colonized. That is why the script used to write Amharic is based upon the South Arabian script, similar to that used by the Nabateans who built Petra. It is probably why Petra, carved from the living rock, is uncannily like the rock-cut churches of Ethiopia as well. The only places where you find these so-called African civilizations is in those parts of the continent which were colonized by Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The only stone buildings are those built as part of these intrusive cultures. There are no African civilizations, not if we use the traditional way of classifying what makes a culture a civilization. There was no writing in Africa except that which was taught to them by Arabs and Jews. No stone buildings other than those built under the instructions of Arabs and Jews. There is another way of working out what happened in the distant past, and that's by looking at ethnic groups such as the Beta Israel of Israel, sometimes known as the Falashas. There are over 170,000 black people of Ethiopian heritage living in Israel. These are the descendants of those Jews who helped found the kingdoms of Aksum and so on. They speak a Semitic language similar to Hebrew, the language of high status in Ethiopia. Amharic is high status, and Oromo, the commonest African language, is low status. This tells us all we need to know about the relative positions of Semites and Africans in that part of Africa in ancient times. The fact that I can understand at once the names of those rock-cut churches, although I only understand Hebrew, is sufficient to explain what has happened. To recap, there was no writing in Africa before the arrival of outsiders, and nor were there any stone buildings. All these and other arts were taught to the Africans by Arabs and Jews, and later, of course, European colonizers. Unless these outsiders had arrived and settled there, the Africans would still be living in deplorably primitive conditions akin to those which existed in Europe during the Stone Age.